The flashing red and blue lights cut through the morning fog like a warning shot. A siren blared once sharp jarring, forcing the slow-moving line of vehicles to an abrupt halt in the center of Main Street, Brookridge. Car doors opened. Veterans in dress blues stepped out in confusion. From the front of the procession, the hearse idled silently, its flag-draped coffin barely visible through the glass. Then came the voice, "License and registration," the officer barked coldly, stepping up to the driver of the lead car. Elaine Hayes rolled down her window, her hands trembling. "Officer, this is my husband's funeral. I understand, ma'am, but you're obstructing traffic. This is a violation." Gas rose from the bystanders lining the sidewalks, many with hands over their hearts, some with tears in their eyes. No one moved, no one spoke. The citation pad came out anyway, and within seconds, a crisp white ticket was pressed into Elaine's hand, an official reprimand stamped and signed. Her eyes didn't blink, her voice didn't rise, but something inside her cracked. Because Walter Hayes had already paid his dues on battlefields half a world away. Now even in death he was being disrespected. Just hours earlier, the small town of Brookridge had gathered in reverent silence. Walter Hayes was one of their own, raised on Maple Street, a star football player, before enlisting in the Army at just 18. He served 3 tours in Iraq, earning a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart before coming home to raise 2 children and care for aging neighbors without ever speaking of what he'd endured. He didn't ask for recognition. He never wanted medals or parades. All he wanted was to be remembered properly. Elaine had planned everything with care. Flags draped over cars, veterans on motorcycles riding ahead, their wheels gliding like an honor guard. The church bells had tolled as the procession began. Locals lined the sidewalks with their hands over their hearts. Then just 3 blocks from the cemetery, everything stopped. Because one officer new to the department and unaware of who Walter Hayes was, saw only a line of illegally parked vehicles. And in that moment, a decorated war hero's final journey was reduced to a citation. Elaine sat frozen in the driver's seat, the ticket still fluttering in her lap like an insult made of paper and ink. The silence around her wasn't just shock, it was the sound of an entire town realizing something had gone terribly wrong. And that this was no longer just a funeral, it was the beginning of a fight for honor. There was something about the way Elaine Hayes stood that morning, something unshakable. In the hours following the disgraceful citation issued during her husband Walter's funeral procession, she didn't collapse under grief. She rose. Still dressed in black with her hands clenched around the crumpled piece of paper, Elaine stared out the living room window, as if expecting Walter to walk through the door and tell her this was all a terrible mistake. But the silence was final. Her husband of 42 years, Walter Hayes, Vietnam veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and the man who had once carried 2 wounded soldiers on his back through a jungle under gunfire, was gone. And instead of a final moment of peace, his legacy had been interrupted by a ticket. Her son Thomas sat across from her, jaw tight, fists balled. "We can't let this go, Mom," he said. "They disrespected him." In front of everyone, Elaine didn't flinch. "Then we won't." Word spread quickly in Brookridge. By evening, calls poured in from neighbors, old service buddies, and even total strangers. Some had seen the officer step into the street and halt the caravan. Some had recorded it. Others had stood stunned as the citation was handed to a grieving widow, while taps still played in the distance. That night, Elaine contacted the Brookridge Veterans Alliance. The call was answered by retired Colonel David Morales, a man who had served with Walter in the Gulf decades earlier. His voice, though aged, still carried the weight of command. And when Elaine explained what had happened, there was a long pause. Then just 3 words, "I'm coming over." Colonel Morales arrived in full-dress uniform. He sat down at the kitchen table, laid his cap beside Walter's obituary, and said, "This isn't just about a ticket. This is about something far deeper, something sacred." He leaned in. "Walter stood for this country when it needed him most. Now it's our turn to stand for him." The next morning, the movement began. Elaine Thomas and Colonel Morales formed a core team reaching out to fellow veterans, church leaders, and local reporters. They launched a petition demanding the citation be dropped and policy changed to protect veteran funeral processions from future violations. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Videos of the procession surfaced online, a line of cars moving solemnly through the heart of town, flags waving gently, children saluting as the caravan passed. And then the jarring image of Officer Nolan Grant stepping out from behind his patrol car, stopping the hearse and handing Elaine a ticket. It was enough to enrage even the quietest voices. "I served with Walter," one old Marine posted, "and I swear on my boots this will not stand." Protests began in front of the Brookridge Police Department, not the angry, chaotic kind, but silent ones. Rows of veterans stood in formation, holding flags, standing guard over the memory of a fallen brother. Motorcyclists from Patriot Guard riders rode through town with banners that read, "Honor, not handcuffs." Elaine stood at every gathering, never shouting, never angry, just firm, just present, just a widow refusing to let her husband be forgotten for the wrong reason. Meanwhile, Thomas took to social media. His post, accompanied by a photo of his father in uniform, read, "They gave my father a ticket for dying with dignity. We're not asking for special treatment, we're demanding respect." That post went viral overnight. Soon, national veteran organizations reached out, lawmakers called, talk radio hosts picked up the story. And yet Officer Nolan Grant and the Brookridge Police Department remained silent. The citation still stood. Colonel Morales wasn't surprised. "They're hoping we fade away," he told the growing group of supporters one evening. But Walter didn't fade away in Da Nang. He didn't fade away in the Gulf. And by God, we won't fade now. They continued collecting testimonies. Dozens of community members came forward with statements, video footage, and personal stories of Walter's impact on the town, from mentoring local teens to volunteering at the food bank to fixing broken fences for neighbors without being asked. One man, a grocer named Alan Rivera, stepped forward in tears. "When my son overdosed, it was Walter who sat on my porch every morning for 2 weeks, just to make sure I didn't give up." These weren't just character witnesses. They were a town telling the world that Walter Hayes was more than a man. He was a cornerstone. By week 3, they'd gathered enough evidence to submit a formal complaint to the city council. A public hearing was scheduled, and Elaine was invited to speak. The night before, Thomas found her in the living room, staring at her husband's medals. "You ready, Mom?" he asked. Elaine didn't look up. She just nodded. For Walter, always. The next day, the town packed into City Hall, veterans in uniform, young kids holding signs that read, "My grandpa deserves respect." Even the mayor attended. Elaine stood at the podium holding the folded flag from her husband's casket. Her voice didn't tremble. "You may not have known Walter Hayes, but he fought for you anyway. And all we asked was to say goodbye." There was no applause, just silence. The kind of silence that demanded justice. And across the room, the police chief leaned forward, finally listening. Because this wasn't just about a traffic violation anymore. It was about how a nation says farewell to those who gave everything. Word spread faster than anyone in Brookridge expected. Within hours of the Hayes family's story being shared online, first by the Brookridge Veterans Alliance, then picked up by regional news, the small town found itself at the center of a national debate. A photo of Elaine Hayes holding the citation outside the police station, eyes red, but jaw clenched in quiet resolve, went viral. The caption beneath it read, "Widow of decorated veteran Walter Hayes issued traffic citation during his funeral procession." Within 24 hours, the image had been shared more than 400,000 times. Veterans across the country began posting in solidarity. Korean war vets in Minnesota, Navy medics in Florida, young Marines in California. They shared their stories, their grief, and their fury. "This isn't just about Walter," one user posted. "It's about every single one of us who ever wore the uniform and was promised dignity." Cable news stations picked it up next. Reporters camped outside the Hayes home, and Colonel David Morales, now acting as the family's spokesperson, gave measured but powerful interviews. "This is not about vengeance," he told a local anchor. "This is about restoring honor and making sure no family endures what the Hayeses did." Then the footage emerged. Captured by a bystander at the corner of Main and Willow, the video showed the procession moving slowly, respectfully under escort. The officer issuing the citation wasn't stopping traffic, he was stopping mourning. The footage was clear. The cars weren't blocking traffic. They were honoring a man who gave his life to serve this country. It was damning. Comment sections lit up with outrage. Public figures, including war heroes and state senators, posted their support. Hashtags like "Justice for Walter" and "Honor" Our veterans trended for days. Even a former Secretary of Defense tweeted, "A funeral procession for a veteran is not a traffic violation. It's a sacred American tradition." Back in Brookridge, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who had once stood silently now rallied. Local businesses displayed signs that read, "We stand with the Hayes family." Hundreds joined a peaceful candlelight vigil outside Town Hall, many wearing military caps, others clutching faded photos of loved ones they'd lost. The town that once held its breath in shame now roared in defiance. Elaine watched it all unfold from her modest living room, stunned. "I never imagined," she whispered to her son Thomas one night, "that your father's last ride would become this." Thomas nodded. "Dad always said sometimes the uniform doesn't come off. Maybe this is what he meant." But beneath the flood of support and national attention, there remained one final challenge to the hearing. It had been scheduled, quietly at first, a routine administrative procedure to review the citation. But after the story went viral, that changed. News cameras were banned, but the courtroom was packed. Veterans lined the pews, their presence alone, a quiet act of protest. A few police officers sat near the back, stiff and uncomfortable under the scrutiny. Elaine arrived wearing Walter's burial flag folded neatly in her arms. Thomas stood beside her, one hand gripping a binder of evidence, photos, statements, and the viral video. Colonel Morales, dressed in civilian clothes but unmistakably military in bearing, stood silently behind them. As the proceedings began, a hush fell over the room. The city attorney read the citation aloud: "Obstruction of a public roadway during a non-permitted procession." The words felt sterile, disconnected from the raw grief behind them. Elaine's turn came. She stood slowly, voice steady, and addressed the panel. "My husband didn't die on a battlefield," she began, "but he lived every day of his life like he still carried one with him. He gave everything for this country. That funeral was the last thing we could give him in return, and instead, we were given a fine." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then as she sat, the back doors opened. In walked State Trooper Captain Reese Taylor. His uniform was sharp, his face unreadable. He made his way to the front, stopping beside the panel without asking for permission to speak. "I'm not here to make a statement," he said firmly. "I'm here to correct a mistake." He reached into his folder and pulled out the original citation. Then slowly and deliberately, he tore it in half. Gasps filled the courtroom. Elaine covered her mouth. Thomas froze. Captain Taylor turned to the panel. "This citation never should have been issued. The footage is clear. The purpose of the procession was clear. The man being honored, Staff Sergeant Walter Hayes, deserved more. We all failed him that day. On behalf of the state, I apologize to the Hayes family and the Brookridge community." Someone began to clap. Then another. Soon the entire room stood in thunderous applause, not for Taylor, but for Walter. Outside, the crowd waiting in the courtyard erupted when they heard the news. Veterans saluted the sky. Some wept. Strangers embraced. The story that had begun in sorrow now felt like something else entirely. Later that afternoon, Elaine returned to the cemetery with her family. She knelt by Walter's grave, laid the torn citation beside the flag, and whispered, "We stood up, Walt, and they heard us." The tearing of that citation didn't just signal the end of a bureaucratic mistake, it ignited a transformation. As the sound of applause faded in the courtroom, a ripple of emotion passed through the Hayes family and every person in attendance. Elaine Hayes clutched the folded American flag in her arms, her eyes brimming with tears. What began as an insult to her late husband, Walter Hayes, a man who had served with honor and never asked for anything in return, had now become a symbol of something far greater. Back in Brookridge, the news spread quickly. The clip of State Trooper Captain Reese Taylor tearing the citation in half made its way to every corner of the country, accompanied by hashtags like #HonorHayes and "Respect the Fallen." People didn't just watch, they responded. Thousands commented, donated, and even shared their own stories of veterans disrespected in death. It was clear as something had shifted, and the town of Brookridge was the first to act. Within days, the city council held an emergency session. In a unanimous decision, they passed a new ordinance ensuring that all veteran funeral processions would be considered protected events. Local police officers were required to undergo retraining specifically in the handling of military-related ceremonies and grieving families. The police chief, once silent now, stood beside Elaine Hayes at a public press conference. and offered a formal apology, not just for the citation, but for the pain it caused. Elaine accepted with grace, but her mission was just beginning. She channeled her grief into purpose. What happened to Walter, she believed, should never happen again to anyone. She began speaking at town halls, high schools, and veterans centers. Her quiet voice carried the weight of lived experience. She didn't speak in anger. She spoke with resolve. Meanwhile, her son Thomas joined the Brookridge Veterans Council. Though still young, he had inherited his father's integrity and his mother's sense of justice. Inspired by the movement that had grown around his family, he took up the mantle of reform and fighting to ensure policy change reached beyond their town. With the help of Colonel David Morales and other veterans, Thomas launched a regional initiative focused on educating local law enforcement about military funeral protocol, veteran mental health, and the lasting impact of disrespect. National outlets picked up the story. Elaine's words were quoted in newspapers from coast to coast. "You may not have worn the uniform, but you can still honor those who did." Interviews followed. She appeared on morning news programs, always humble, always clear-eyed. In one particularly moving segment, she stood at Walter's grave, touching the simple headstone that bore his name and said, "He never wanted medals. He never wanted attention. All he ever asked for was that his brothers and sisters in arms be remembered." What had begun as a humiliating citation had blossomed into a cultural reckoning. Other towns took notice. Similar reforms were passed in nearby counties. Brookridge became a model community for veteran advocacy. Schools incorporated moments of silence for Memorial Day and Veterans Day. A new sign was installed at the entrance of the town, "Welcome to Brookridge, a town that honors its heroes." But perhaps the most powerful change was in the cafe where Walter used to have breakfast every Sunday. A plaque now hung by the window booth, engraved with his name and the words, "Reserved for those who served." Every Sunday, a free breakfast was served to veterans, no questions asked. The community that once stood silently during the procession now stood proudly beside the family it had once failed to protect. Elaine often visited that booth not to eat, but to watch. She would quietly observe young families, teaching their children to stand. When a veteran walked in, neighbors covering tabs for strangers in uniform, and veterans sitting together sharing stories they once kept buried deep. One autumn evening, as leaves scattered across the pavement, Elaine sat across from her son. The sun had dipped, low, casting amber light through the cafe windows. "He'd be proud of you, Mom," Thomas said, breaking the silence. Elaine smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the window. "No," she replied softly, "he'd be proud of all of us. Because now, people see them. People remember." The story of Walter Hayes reminded a nation of something too easily forgotten, that dignity in death is part of the promise made to those who risk everything in life. 6 months passed, but the memory of what happened in Brookridge didn't fade, and it echoed louder with each passing day. What started as a single act of disrespect during Walter Hayes' funeral had grown into a powerful reminder of the strength of a grieving family and a united community. The Day of Honor was officially established by the town council, set to fall each year on the anniversary of Walter's funeral. It wasn't about speeches or ceremony, it was about gratitude. On that day, the streets of Brookridge lined with the neighbors holding flags, children learning to salute, and veterans walking side by side in quiet dignity. No traffic citations, no interruptions, just a moment when the town, no matter how busy, paused to say, "We remember." Schools across the region began teaching Walter Hayes' story as part of their civics curriculum. Young students learned not only about the cost of war, but also the cost of silence in the face of injustice. For many, it was their first lesson in moral courage, one that didn't come from a textbook, but from a widow who refused to back down. Veteran organizations around the country picked up the story. Videos of Elaine Hayes and her son Thomas were shown during ethics trainings and memorial events. The Hayes family never asked for fame, yet they had become something greater, a symbol of what happens when ordinary people stand up for something sacred. At the cemetery, Elaine still visited Walter's grave every Sunday. She would place fresh flowers beside the simple headstone and whisper the same words she had spoken during that first week of outrage, only now with a softness that came from peace, not pain. "We stood up for you," and they listened. The wind carried her voice through the branches across the field, and perhaps she believed into the places where the unseen heroes of war rested in silence. Some stories don't end with a courtroom decision or a news headline, they live on through the changes we choose to make. Elaine Hayes reminded us that honor isn't given by rank or ceremony, it's upheld by the living, by those who refuse to forget. So if you believe respect should never expire with a folded flag, leave a comment below and tell us how you honor the veterans in your life. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful emotional stories that echo long after the video ends. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded.